let us get into the Montauk project. First of all, we'll leave this slide on, there's no problem. The Montauk project was something which had a strange history and how it came about. First of all, there is a military base which has existed on Long Island. It was built sometime after 1900. The U.S. government literally kicked out the Montauk Indians, which is one of the ways it achieved the name, off of the extreme eastern tip. There was a reservation there which they had. They kicked them out on some pretext. They tore down the pyramids that were there. There were pyramids at that location. I don't know if there are any photos extant today of them. And then built the military base, which was Fort Hero, an army base, and 2 underwater submarine pens for underwater entrance of submarines. And that whole facility was completely active until about 1983. And the Navy shut it down in 83, from what I understand. The Army had moved out a little bit earlier, though not 100%. But this base existed through World War I, through World War II. And after World War II was over, and Brookhaven National Laboratory started its research programs, many of them, of course. One of the most interesting ones, of course, is what we have traced, and that was, of course, some of the German scientists coming to the U.S. after the end of the war. We've been working on mind control and also on time travel, and those projects went to Brookhaven. Nobody said much of anything. Nobody in Congress read the reports. See, it's a national laboratory, which means being tax reported, it must make monthly reports to somebody in the government, either the House or the Senate or both. And those reports were made. Nobody read them. And around 1967, somebody started to read them. In 67 into 68. And what they read was that they were working on mind control projects, and some of the senators took one look at this and says, mind control, they may use it on us. Cancel the project and kick those guys out of there. So they did. And of course the ex-German scientists were looking for a place to continue their work, and they didn't have too far to go. Brookhaven National Laboratories is right in the middle of the island. Let me see if I can spot it for you there in this picture. Again, a map from AAA. The Brookhaven area is basically right in here. And of course the extreme eastern tip of the island we're referring to, way out here at Montauk Point, was where Montauk Air Force Base was later installed in 1951 approximately, on the same property as the military base called Fort Hero. It became Montauk Air Force Station in addition to the other facilities. The scientists went there to that location at Brookhaven first. They were kicked out of there. They didn't have too far to go out the eastern end of the island. Talked with the military and told them what they were doing. He says, how would you like to have a weapon system that you can win a future war with, where you don't have to shoot anybody, just push a few buttons and they all give in. Mind control was the object, the idea. And of course the military guys there liked it, so they invited them in. That was about 1968. In 69, the Air Force finished their tests on the radar systems they were working on, the over-horizon radar. They developed at Long Island the SAGE system, and then the follow-on one, which was a much more powerful version, which went up into Canada. And when those 2 systems were completed in terms of the R&D, they shut down their operations there, and the Army was more or less pulled out, and it became known as a surplus base. In GSA's annals, General Services Administration, there was a surplus base supposedly uninhabited. Well, it was inhabited by the scientists who came from Brookhaven. And they kept their work going, and they were working on modifying some of the equipment that was left behind. There was tons and tons of equipment, and I do have some slide documentation of this. In any case, they continued their work. The power was kept on. The bills for the power was paid by the state of New York Parks Commissions. It took a lot of research to track this stuff down. The Preston was very busy at it. Averaged about $55,000 a month for the electric bill in that period of time. It's probably more now. But in any case, they kept it going. And these guys kept doing their work. And the principal product became what we call the Montauk station in the Montauk operation involving modified hardware in the radar tower, a whole new system which involved computers, about 8 to 10 years worth of work by aliens working in conjunction with us to produce the computer algorithms that were necessary to produce a time tunnel. But let's go back a little bit prior to this Montauk operation and see how the groundwork was set for this to happen. Back in the time when the two projects locked up, and this becomes one of these crazy things like which came first, the chicken or the egg. We won't attempt to answer that question. But in any case, when the two did lock up, they created a huge hole, or huge rift, if you will, in space-time, 40 years wide. That was what I was showing on the blackboard, that those 2 points there created a rift in space-time 40 years wide, and what happened when that occurred was that very large ships, very large numbers of ships and aliens were able to come through from other domains that could not get through previously. I'm not saying there weren't aliens here before that. There's been plenty of them here, and there's a lot of documentation in the government's annals and elsewhere, including a lot of open public literature showing that aliens in some form or other have been on this planet for at least 10,000 years. You can go back through the Bible, you can go back through the Tassili frescoes, you can go back through a lot of other documentation that comes out of not only Africa, but also the Middle East and the Far East. The records are there. There have been aliens. They've been visiting us for ages, but they didn't set up colonies, huge colonies. Comes a period from 43 to 83, large numbers come through, and they invade, and then you start getting the problems like showed up at Roswell, two crashing in 47, another White Sands grounds, proving grounds in 48, another one at Roswell in 49, the overflights of the White House in 52 and 3, and the whole 9 yards of this. It rather terrified the military, but of course they're very good at keeping their mouths shut. And of course in 53 with the overflights of the White House, it's got in the press all over the U.S. At that time there was no suppression of information. I'm saying up to 53. Now what happened with the overflights of the White House is forbidden territory. Well, who are they? Well, obviously our fighter craft couldn't catch them, couldn't do anything with them. So they had meetings with the National Security Agency. And of course there was a split vote. Some of them wanted to make the whole mess public and let the public see what was going on, and others wanted to bury it. It was tied 6-6, and of course the chairman at that point, who normally didn't vote, had to break the tie. And who was it? Richard Spillhouse Nixon, the head of the National Security Agency. He voted to bury it. So the project was buried. The whole of the information was buried, and they set up Project Blue Book, two of them, one for the public and one for the military. They kept the investigations going, of course, but the overflights continued, and there were aspects of World War II, how heavy it was, I'll get into briefly, but in that period of 1953-54, they kept flying over, and finally one, or perhaps more than one, UFO-type craft landed at Edwards Air Force Base out in the middle of the California desert, and literally defied the military, our military, to take their ships apart, to break into them, to cut them, to do anything with them. And they stood by for 2 weeks while CIA scientists and others attempted to cut into these ships, and they couldn't do a cotton-picking thing with them. The military, of course, was panicking. What are we going to do with these guys? They finally invite President Eisenhower down there to see this and witness it, and he apparently did from a distance, but they wouldn't allow him to get up real close. The military pleaded with him and said, you got to make a treaty with these guys of some kind. He says, we got to buy time to find out what to do about this and what to do with them. So that became the point for the famous Greada Treaty. Eisenhower signed in 54. And there is some documentation outside of the normal military channels. It was in the hands of BSRA for years when Riley Crabb was alive running it. And he moved to New Zealand after he resigned, until he gave it up and died in New Zealand. But when he was alive, he showed me some of the letters, and there was a letter from one of the people who was there who witnessed this entire thing, including Eisenhower being there, and the fact that everybody was just about panicking, and nobody knew for sure what was going to come out of it. But he wrote a letter, wound up in the BSRA files, and I did read it. So it wasn't a joke. But they made the decision make an agreement with the aliens. What was the nature of that agreement? The nature of the agreement was manifold, but basically, number one, we will not interfere with each other's civilization. Number two, there will be technical assistance between both of us to each other, exchange of technical information. And three, since the aliens claimed that they were a dying race and needed to, quote, create a new body line, unquote, our government agreed to build an underground basis for them, providing them with biological and genetic research facilities, and generally help them with this problem. And of course they also mentioned the fact, well, we have been abducting some humans for medical examination. We're not doing anything to them, but we'll give you lists of those whom we continue to abduct. It's an ongoing process. They gave a few lists out, according to what I've heard, and then they stopped. Eventually the military and the U.S. government, the secret operations in the government, found out that they'd made really a bad deal. The aliens were getting the better end of it. Make a long story short, or shorter, I should say, because the story is not over and it's still ongoing. We built a lot of bases starting in 1959 underground. Phil Schneider, a friend of mine, was part of the team of the geologists to help build those underground bases, underground railroad systems, communications, eventually underground highway systems all over the U.S. and Canada. And in some of those underground bases moved some of the aliens to work on genetics and genetic biological operations, and I've heard some real horror stories from eyewitnesses. But the thing was ongoing. It couldn't be stopped, and it has resulted in the period of time from 54 till today with some amazing breakthroughs in technology and biology, possibly energy systems, time travel, and you name it, all kinds of strange things came out of this because of alien technology. It was agreed, of course, we don't interfere with each other's civilization. One of the things that was involved here in that agreement was the fact that our new radar systems that the Air Force was using ran at about 435 megahertz, quite high power, directly interfered with the navigational systems of the alien ships and was causing them to crash. That's why two crashed in Roswell in 47, another White Sands in 48, another one at Roswell in 49, or Roswell area. And this was an ongoing process the Air Force found out about, and they started doing it deliberately. Bring them down. Came the treaty, they couldn't do it anymore. Not only that, but they had to change operational frequencies on these radar systems because of the fact they were interfering so heavily with the navigational systems of the aliens. I do not know all the technical aspects of this, but Preston Nichols got involved with some classified projects, including examining one of the more of the down ships in the navigational systems, and they were involved in a very peculiar system. They said the more advanced ones used vacuum tubes of multi-element design, so the operating frequency is about 435 megs, and the reason for that was the fact that the aliens communicated telepathically with the computer. And this is apparently a standard window frequency, now well defined by the government. So most of the radar systems were moved off of that frequency. Later on, when Montauk went fully operational, it was back around 425 to 435 megs. But it was highly focused energy, and it wasn't aimed at aliens, so they got away with it for a while until they changed the nature of the system. This was where it started. Montauk was a result of many aspects, and of course the agenda in designing the system involved technology from aliens as well as our own technology. As they said to us, and I was heavily involved in the Montauk project for many years, he says, you can build the hardware. He said, that's no problem. He says, you don't know the theory. And quite literally, much of the theory in our textbooks is way off base. Part of it's deliberate disinformation, and part of it is just we don't know. It's a mix. But in any case, we didn't know the whole story. They filled us in, so to speak, and we started building the Montauk project. There was a group called the Leverons, which are from the Iran Confederation, which provided the techniques and the technology for computers and the computer data and the algorithms and all of that. And by 76, when we had a good operating system, it was faulty, but it worked. We were using IBM 360s and 370s, which of course were the state of the art in those days. with everything that went with the 360 and 370. And a few years later, of course, the Cray 1 came along, which was plugged into the system. They tried to make the time tunnel operation, and when I say a time tunnel, I better define a little more carefully what I mean. There was the capability of projecting and creating a tunnel. Literally, you could see it. In the early stages, it was above ground. Later on, they abandoned the use of that microwave tower. Then it was underground. It would create a hole in a solid wall when it was on because of the other electronics in back of it, which was about 8 feet in diameter, big enough to drive a small truck into. And this tunnel was lit, and it was not only a tunnel going through time, but it was a tunnel going to some other physical location in our known physical universe. It could be on the other side of the Earth, it could be on the Moon, it could be on Mars. It was used for that purpose back in '82. Or, as the rumors had it, they were playing games with the other side of a galaxy. They had the theoretical capability, they probably used it. But it was a time tunnel, which meant they could bore, and it only required the transmitter at one end. There was no receiver necessary at the other end. It did not dissociate atomically the object being shipped through the tunnel. It remained in its normal state. So there was no disruption of the physiological functions of the human body. There was no disruption of an article or an object being sent through the tunnel, unless the tunnel failed, and that happened a lot in the early days. They lost quite a lot of objects out in space, and maybe they lost people, I don't know. So they finally resolved it so it worked properly, and they could send this person or object through space to another location. And when they wanted the object, the person to come back or to bring an object back, they would reverse the phase of it, so instead of it being pushing the person out, it would suck them in from the outer end back to the station. Rather advanced technology, but it worked. And it was refined, and it was used more and more for a lot of strange operations. That's not the only thing they did at Montauk, but that was the principal thing. The other thing that we're working on was mind control. Let's get into that a little bit later. I want to show you some of the pictures here, because historically what happened to me was that after I grew up as Al Bielek, I was very interested in UFOs, and eventually tripped across the trail of Preston Nichols. I was a founding member of the Psychotronics Association, USPA, and I was from '75 onward, and I went to many of the lectures. In it was '73, I ran into Preston Nichols at one of them. In '75, we all showed up, Preston, myself, and his new lab assistant, Duncan Cameron, who at that point I didn't know from Adam, at the Dayton, Ohio conference. And it was because of that meeting there and talking with Duncan and realizing he had some connection with me, and he realized it also, but we didn't know what at that point. Preston invited me out to visit him in his facility, his lab facility on Long Island sometime, and an invitation I availed myself of 1 month later, in August of '85. And this was, I'd say '85, it was '83 when I first ran into him, about the time the Montauk project collapsed. In '85 I went out to Long Island. He took Duncan and I on a truck trip, or his van out. He says, "I know you people, you guys have never been out here to Montauk before. Ho, ho, ho." That was the biggest joke of the year. We didn't know it. Nor did he. Took us out there, and we were very badly disturbed by what we saw and what we felt. And that trip was documented later again in May of 1986 on another trip which involved 3 people from Phoenix, Arizona, sponsored by Senator Barry Goldwater, who got wind of this thing and had heard nothing about it, could find nothing whatever in the government records of any funding for such a huge project, because I went back in '85, and I happened to run into some people at ASU. One of them was the nephew of Senator Barry Goldwater. I didn't know at that time that he was a nephew. And I mentioned they wanted to have me work with him on some Tesla projects, and I mentioned this monster project in Long Island. He got interested. And obviously he talked to his uncle. And his uncle got interested. He could find no financial records anywhere in the government, any oversight committees or anything else, showing money being funneled to a huge project on eastern Long Island. They got a little upset about this. There's no records. How the hell are they paying for it? took us a long time to find out how. It didn't come out of government money. Not 1 cent of government money went into that project. Government personnel was stationed out there, TDY, temporary duty, and paid elsewhere. From the station director to a lot of the other personnel, military, and friend Lenny, who was the nephew, had a lot of contacts. I knew Bill Casey personally. I never found out why. Bill Casey was a director at the CIA for a number of years. And he asked him, "You ever hear of a project out in eastern Long Island?" He said, "Oh yes." I said, "What can you tell me about it?" He says, "Nothing." He knew all about it. The intelligence community knew about it, but no one in Congress or the Senate knew about it. It's a long story that follows after that. Eventually it was established who funded it and who ran it. But I went back in May of '86 for another visit, along with Lenny and 2 of his friends from Phoenix, whom I knew, and came the documentation. So let's get into some of the documentation of what we saw and what we found. Then we go a little further after that. Can we have some of the lights down so we can see the slides a little better? Good. This map of Long Island, as I pointed out, Brookhaven National Laboratory is in here. Down in this section is Islip and Babylon. In the area here of East Islip is where Preston lives. The Babylon area is here, and as you go out here to a little island which doesn't show in this picture called Captree Island, that's where Duncan lives currently still. And of course there's a highway here going back into New York. But the rest of this Fire Island strip is inhabited partially, but there are no highways. But you can take the freeways on out and go past the section where Brookhaven is and go out to the eastern end of the island. Not the North Fork, but the South Fork, and eventually you get to a little town called Montauk, and then you'll get to Montauk Point. Well, we took that trip that time. The next slide. I mean to show you a little more about this. In the old maps, they showed Montauk Air Force Station as still being there, but inactive. And the main highway is the Montauk Highway 27. There is the Montauk Town. There's an Indian reservation that's still there. And you take it on out, and you wind up at the State Park, where there's a very large lighthouse commissioned by George Washington. And the park, if you know where to get into it. And we did. Next. In that trip, we documented everything. I did and other people did. There's a little rise in the ground there as you leave the town of Montauk, and you will see that radar tower sticking up above the horizon. I mean, it is rather high and it is rather large. These blotches, we've never been able to figure out what they are. Experts in photography say, well, that was film bath processing problems, but it didn't show up on the originals, only the prints, and there's something strange about it. Some of them showed up on originals, some didn't. Next slide. As you get closer, this radar tower looms up higher and higher, and you see a few of the other buildings. Then you park your vehicle and walk through what are literally broken down fences, and I'm speaking of 1985. And you can walk all over the base at that time, and we did. Next slide. You get in there, there's military installations everywhere, and then there's this huge tower. It's actually 5 stories, double height stories, plus the antenna on the top. It's at about 125 tons. It's just about 60 feet vertical, 120 feet across. But it's left of the feed horn system, and of course the waveguides, much of which have fallen out, were down there. But we went in the tower, inside the building, all over the place. And we continue to document. Next slide. This is what it looks like close up to the building, which is still intact. And the antenna, which you can see is quite huge. Now these were black and white shots. Again, another one. It had some special antennas mounted on that main frame, which we used. That was an omnidirectional. There was another one which was directional. Next slide. And again, some of the details of the feed horns. This was large size feed horns, because they were pumping literally hundreds of megawatts in there of RF. There again was one of the antennas. This was the directional one, I think, and they had a rotating base that's still being used for certain things. And the cables show for that. Next slide. Now it's a close-up of the directional one. That's still up there. Next slide. From the tower, which we went into and climbed up the stairs, the elevator shaft didn't work anymore. There was a huge elevator there, but it was power shut off and nothing was blocked. And as we found out, there was a concrete plug at the ground level floor to keep the elevator from going on down to the underground. As research showed, there were at that point 6 levels of underground, and that was expanded between 83 collapse and 87 into another 2 levels underground, or 8 levels underground. But from the tower you got a beautiful view of the entire base and all of the buildings. Next slide. And there were some other radar systems which had been stripped. These were the platforms where they were, and you can see the remains of some of the connecting cables and cable lines. And there were barracks and roadways. As you can see, some of the roadways. Next slide. More of the buildings, and there was another radar tower there. There's apparently a water cistern here. The roads wound all over the place, many barracks. They were still intact but not used. Next slide. More of the same. Next. The interior to the building, we found in the radar tower some very, very heavy hardware, which was obviously too heavy to move out because the scavengers, if you will, the local people who like to steal, borrow surplus electronic equipment, which has been abandoned. Literally it was abandoned. This little modulation transformer, now that was the 3-phase input transformer, weighed probably 600 to 800 pounds. And that was one of the pieces of equipment we saw. On the next slide, you can see here one of the modulation transformers, which was operating at quite high voltage because it drove ampletrons, where the plate voltage was over 20,000. This was one of the ampletrons. There were 2 up in the radar tower, built by Raytheon. Each one of those assemblies, where you had magnetic coils in here, liquid cooling, all of the cooling controls. You had an RF feed and you had a waveguide output up here, which is no longer there. Each one of those things cost over $1 million. We found out from later records that the Air Force or whomever, and we believe now it was ITT, ordered the purchase of 4,000 of those things at $1 million apiece. That was for more than one location. There were 26 locations. All of the SAGE radar systems in the U.S. were converted to be operational. Eventually, many of them were shut down. This was the other one. There were 2 up there. And had part of the coil system off of it so you can get a better view of it. There was one, which is not on the slide, showing the raw ampletron tube, which if it failed, Raytheon would take it back if it hadn't been cracked or broken and give a credit for a used burnout tube of $100,000. That's how valuable those things were. This is the traffic circle we found in there, and this is the one I had to stand in when I was shipped back there in 47 to go to 83 and get my brains removed, so to speak, and the body size reduced to that of an infant so they could plug me into the Bielek family and make me Al Bielek, something which I knew nothing about for many, many years. This was one of the smashed buildings we found around there, and this is reminiscent of what happened in 83. So this whole project was operational through 83, and in the day of, actually 2 or 3 days before 12 August 83, I was working there and I was told to go take a hike, take a vacation, and Duncan was put in confinement somewheres because in the early morning hours of 12 August 83, Duncan arrived as the original Duncan and I arrived as Ed Cameron, and they couldn't have us meeting ourselves, so I was off base and Duncan was locked up, so to speak, in another part of the base. Leave it, back up one. Thank you. The story goes that after we left in our little 12-hour sojourn there, Duncan, the current Duncan, number 2, had for weeks felt that that station was very evil and had to be destroyed. At one point, he was very much gung-ho about it and so forth, but someplace along the line he got religion, so to speak, and a few other people with him, Preston Nichols included. I was invited to join the plot and I refused. it was decided that at some point that was convenient, they would have to bring down the station. So the plot was cooked, and they knew they couldn't be operational until after we had come in from the Eldridge and gone back out, because the records were there and von Neumann had them, because he was technical advisor at that point. We arrived, we left. Then Duncan was placed in the chair, and I'll get into that a little more in a few minutes. The one that picks up his mental, psychic feelings and ideas. And he had been pre-programmed by Preston, so that under a command, for words perhaps like the time is now, I'm not saying those are the exact words, but something like that, sitting in the chair, he would release from his subconscious one of these tulpas, or mental images, out of his head. It would go into the computer through the pickup coils. It would be clothed physically into a three-dimensional solid form, because the computer had long since been tested, and the whole system had long since been tested to prove they could take a thought form and make a physical reality out of it, which at first was not enduring. When they turned the power off, it disappeared, but after a while they found out how to make it last. So you could quite literally create a chair out of somebody's thoughts. Well, he sat in the chair, he created this mental image, or hauled it up out of his subconscious. It became clothed in reality and became Junior, as we called him, running all over the place. The descriptions of those who saw it varied from 12 feet in height to 35 feet in height, and I suspect that depended on how terrified the person was who saw it. There is a mental tendency to exaggerate, of course. But this thing went around smashing buildings just like that, because this looked like a huge fist came down on it. There was one or two left in that shape still. This was 85, and this whole sequence of events occurred in 83. So we looked around, we saw that evidence. We felt, Duncan and I did, on that first trip, that some very strange, evil phenomena had taken place here. Some kind of a crazy giant, or whatever it was, had wandered on the base at one time. In the process of the film documentation, went up to the top of the tower, and they took a scan, photos of everything in every direction. And as the next photo shows, they caught a photo of this thing from the tower. We couldn't see it. It was quite invisible to our eyes, but not to the camera. And it was an ordinary 35 millimeter camera with ordinary black and white film. And that was it right there. We estimate 12 feet high, but it's purely an estimate, because there's nothing near it which would give us a scale of reference. This structure here was the remains of gunnery emplacements from World War II. They had railroad guns. They had rails going up to it to feed ammo. They were never used, but they were there. And eventually it was dismantled, and some of the stuff cracked. But Junior was standing nearby, and that was him. And in the next picture, we did a blow-up. That's what he looked like. Very much like a Sasquatch. But it came out of Duncan's subconscious. Those may be legs or appendages there. There seemed to be arms, and some kind of a head, some kind of a torso. And there he sat. Or stood, I should say. Unmoving, apparently, for years. So we went back in '93 for another filming operation, and Preston swore that this thing was moving. Well, since Montauk went back online full power from '93 onward, it was on partially from '87 on. After that night, what happened, this thing went around smashing buildings and tried to get in the radar tower and couldn't. It was much too strong for it, but it threw a few people into the tower and killed a few bodies. The word went from Jack Pruitt to Preston. At least that's the best story I can come up with as to the evidence. It says you're going to go in that tower and you're going to shut down the transmitter. The problem was that they cut all the external power lines feeding the transmitter and the tower. They got the lights off, but the transmitter kept on running. It had done what Einstein had warned years before would happen, which he said, if you make a machine with sufficient complexity and give it enough power, in time it will of itself become intelligent. And this station did. It developed its own personality, had all of the algorithms from the computers, had all of the most advanced knowledge on physics, energy, and so forth. It tapped the Dirac sea and provided its own power to keep itself going. It wasn't about to be shut off. So Preston had to go in there with acetylene torches with a 45 at his head, as he was not about to go in. And Jack Pruitt allegedly said, "You are going in there, and this is why," and held the gun at his head. He went in, he cut the cabling, he cut enough of the sections between the computers and the RF drives and the actual drive systems for the two amplitrons up in the tower, which actually fed 24 more down below, an enormous power output. And when enough was cut, the transmitter died, everything went off, and Junior disappeared to that status, sitting there. In '93, when everything was back online full power, there were people that saw Junior moving around, even allegedly, and I can't prove this, allegedly swimming in the surf east of the island off of Montauk Point, where the lighthouse is. That was one report I heard. It was never verified, but Preston said he had seen some evidence that Junior was moving around on the island as long as the transmitter was on and running. It feeds on whatever that power is that was coming out of the transmitter, even the revised one. And when the power is down, the transmitter's off. It does not have the energy to move around in a solid three-dimensional form. It's not visible to the eye. It's only visible to the camera, and also video cameras that will pick it up. Next slide. Next. In the underground, we had to learn to work with aliens. And some of the types we saw were like this. These are not photos. They're sketches done by people who have been in the underground, seen these creatures and worked with them. And from memory, because they were all brainwashed and wiped to their memories before they left Montauk, under hypnosis or other recall techniques, they were able to draw these sketches. This was one of the more common ones that was seen down there, like this. More than probably a Leveron, we're not sure what it was. This is one of the reptilian types, very much like a Draco. And a Draco is from Draconis Major, which is a fair distance from here, but these creatures stand 7 feet tall, weigh 450 pounds, and are extremely intelligent. There was one there stationed there all the time in the underground. He represented the alien interests for the use of the Montauk Project. This was more like a gray, though not exactly like a gray. Next slide. These were the tall black grays, Zeta Reticuli types, 7 feet tall, very old. As far as we could determine, very self-centered and quite evil in terms of our moral standards or ethical standards. They run 7 to 8 feet tall. Supposedly an insect base to the genetic makeup. All of these grays have one peculiar thing, except one class that stand about 5.5 feet tall. They have no genitalia. They do not reproduce in the normal manner we consider normal. Essentially, it's done by cloning in a very complicated process. Next slide. The little 3.5 footers look like this. They have very strange hands. They got 4 fingers, rather large head, strange eyes, and that's essentially the way they look when they did the autopsies on them and the very physical examinations. And the hands, in many cases, on the next slide, will show like this: 4 fingers. They have an extra digit in there, some of them do, and a claw-like hand. And notice the phalanx here for the finger bones: 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 3 bones in our fingers out from the wrist. They have 4. And this was supposedly verified by a CIA employee in '78. And these aliens are shown up all over, not just the underground of Montauk. Next. This was one of those that we classed as Sirius A. They look virtually human, but they have one peculiar characteristic: the eyes. They don't have round pupils like we do. They have vertical slit pupils, much like a cat. And they did carry strange symbols on their tunics. This strangely rounded triangular figure is reminiscent of the Trilateral Commission. What this thing was in here was one of their symbols. I do not know what it represented. Next slide. They were involved in a lot of strange mind control operations. They provided some of the hardware, and eventually, as some of the victims remembered, it was the aliens, typically the Syrians, who were operating the mind manipulating hardware. And of course, I might add, the basic people running this on the human level were the former German scientists who came over from Germany, and they had a lot of ideas of their own on mind control. Next slide. One of the experimental chairs was built like that, which had later evolved into the Montauk chair, which we have no pictures of which was used by Preston and others. This was in the subsequent investigations. We found various strange signs. This one here, Camp Hero, section of Montauk, Cape Point State Park, etc., etc. There was a section donated to the town of Montauk for the fishermen. There was a special gate you could go in, drive in with your truck if you had the right license and the right paraphernalia. And they would park on the top of this bluff. Next slide. That's not the bluff, that's the Coast Guard antenna system we found there in the trip back in '93, looking for evidence of the resurrection of the project. That had nothing to do with the project, but was new. Next slide. Supposedly 30 watts out, but we found cables were much too heavy for the 30 watt supposed power limitation. Next slide. All automated, but this was a antenna matching box. Next slide. And the station, which itself was totally automatic. There were no personnel. We found a lot of evidence. New telephone boxes in the ground. They weren't rusty, they weren't old. And on the telephone poles, new phone poles, new switch boxes or cable boxes. Next. New power line transformers, approximately 50 megawatts each. Old and new cable runs mixed together. That's Preston Nichols picking it up to show one of the new cable runs. And of course, the tower as it still appears in color instead of black and white. Next. I don't know what happened in that one. This is a tower close up. Somebody pirated the very large motors that were up in the top. There were 4 7.5 motors, 7.5 horsepower motors to drive that antenna pedestal. They removed them, threw the shrouds on the ground. They hit the air conditioning system on the way down and dismantled it almost. And the shrouds were found on the ground, but no motors. Next slide. These were additional pictures we took in January 15th of 93, I'm sorry. Up there, that's where the motor used to be, and the part of the gearbox assembly in the back to drive the pedestal, and the entire antenna assembly. Next slide. And that particular day was cold. That was Duncan, standing there half covered. This was one of the guys doing a video documentary which never got finished. Preston fortunately took his own camera along and saved the day by recording it himself. Cold and wintry, that's Preston here in the middle. And we took more pictures of the antenna. We were looking for evidence of its use. We found it, new cabling going up to a special antenna on the top. So it was obviously back in use in some mode. Next slide. That antenna was still there, apparently being used, the directional with a motor rotator. They had to have an E-field established in order to do any of the other manipulations, whether they're underground or not. But here again, photos from the tower taken in '93. There is, of course, the Montauk Lighthouse, which didn't show in the other pictures, the earlier ones. The roads are still there, the buildings are still there. Since that date, they've removed the powerhouse. And again, some of the old buildings. And if you look carefully, you'll find Junior right there, again in '93. Preston has them on video now. Some more of the views of the base from the fence where we break in. One of the problems was somebody got smart and they decided to put a 1/4-inch steel plate door on there with double padlocks, which we could not readily get through or cut. So as the next slide shows, somebody before we arrived in January of '93 conveniently blew a hole through the concrete blocks, quite large enough to walk through, even Preston could. As the next slide shows, there's Peter Belts, who was doing the videos that never got finished on the inside. Next slide. We were looking for more evidence of resurrection of the project, and we found it. This was the old powerhouse, transfer point for power and all the transformer farm, if you will, outside the tower. And we found on one of them, the next slide, this little label, non-PCB transformer. Those of you who are engineers or into the electrical business know that about sometime around 85, 86, the law came down from federal level. You cannot use PCB coolants anymore in newly manufactured transformers because the stuff will spill on the ground and is environmentally a hazard. So they use a different oil. And this is the label. It's a new transformer. What was doing there, we don't know. This is the old powerhouse. It's now gone, but I've documented this thing. Huge diesel generators to drive each one of these generators. The next slide gives you a little better view. It was a huge operation. They used to use all the power from that station. Put out about 2.5 to 5 megawatts per generator. And this is the same traffic circle a few years later, overgrown with weeds, and of course in the summer. This is the bluff where the fishermen fished. Now, I don't know how they're going to do any fishing from up here on the bluff, but that's where they all went and sat and meditated, or whatever they did. If you wanted to get down to the ocean front, about 120 feet below, you could. There were pathways to walk down. As this shows right here, there is a pathway. But we never saw any down there. This was one of the underground, semi-underground blockhouse operations we found. We finally decided to go in and investigate and explore this, see what it was and where it went. So we went in there and took a lot of pictures. Right inside the door was a strange five-sided room. Now this involves memories of people who we can't name now. One of them has written a book on this whole business of his past. The guy who ran the Montauk Boys program used to quite literally, the Montauk boys were brought in as recruits. Many of them wouldn't want to go through the program. They were physically beaten into submission, and some of them didn't live through the beating. But that was where it was done. And in the next slide, there was once a row of bleachers over here where they sat some of the boys to watch, so they get the idea this is what happens to them if they don't go along with the program. There's a vague remains left to the bleachers. Next. Another one of the same. There was a long hallway we went through, and this was in winter, and it was warm, around 52 degrees. We could feel heat coming up through the floor, indicating somebody was still using the underground. But there was pretty much of a mess up here, and as we went through, we saw a lot of wreckage. Next slide. Next slide. This was one of the interrogation rooms with rather rusty furniture. Next slide. I guess one didn't drop down. All right. This was one of the rooms where there must have been a rather bad fire. Why? We don't know. What it was used for, we don't know, but this is part of the documentation in that underground, semi-underground building. Next slide. And that was one of the side rooms. We didn't really find anything in there. This is Helga Morrow, who was a well-known psychic from Tucson, Arizona, came along on this particular trip because she was convinced that her father, Dr. Kurpis from Germany, PhD in math and physics, was part of the project, and we did find evidence that he had been. But she went along on this trip. We went to the back end of this hall, and this is what we found. This barbed wire enclosure where the door could be locked. And as we went in the room, we saw these pellets. I had been in there once before, but this time she, I, Duncan, and Preston went in there, and we could pick up the vibes, and she got it very strongly. This is where many of the Montauk boys have been beaten, were laid out naked on those slabs, and some of them died that way. The vibes from that were very evident. She felt it. Duncan felt it. In fact, that was one of the first times Duncan ever broke down and cried. It's on the video, but it's not on the photos. Down to the end, we don't know what else was down there, but it was essentially more of the same type of enclosures. Preston and Helga walked down there. They didn't find anything. There's a blank wall. And this was Duncan. About 2 minutes before he broke out in tears, you could tell he was being hit hard emotionally. He suddenly realized, because he was one of the principal programmers for the Montauk boys, his involvement in what had happened. And this is the Montauk Lighthouse, built by commissioned by George Washington, is still there. It's on solid rock. The Air Force likes to say, or did like to say, that this whole area out there is sand. There couldn't be any underground base. There was another one of the obfuscation operations they engaged in. I think you all have heard of the wooden dummies that were dropped from the airplanes in 1954, which is what was found on the ground for the Roswell incident. Well, the Air Force can come up with some real stories. We found lots of rock, solid rock. We found remnants of some of the old gun turrets, which was one of them here. And it had a feed system of some kind, which is long since lost. Next slide. But one of the other things that the Air Force said was the whole area is nothing but sand. Well, this 8-story building was built in 1926 for residence and office buildings. Well, 93, it's still there. There aren't any cracks in the walls. But I happen to know of a hospital building that was built in New Orleans about 1945, because when I was in the Navy as Al Bielek from 45 to 46, I was in New Orleans. The first 2 floors of that building, after a year and a half of completion of the structure, were cracking wide open. The internal floors were cracking, the marble floors, and the walls were cracking. I don't know if that building is still there or not. But after a year and a half, built on sand, the building was cracking. Well, this building has no cracks. It's not built on sand. It's still used today. U.S. Air Force Station. The Air Force tried to deny there was a Montauk Air Force Station, but there's the sign proving it was. Got a picture of that. Preston took one of them home. In the days when Montauk was fully operational, the animals all fled. They fled from... They fled from the base of operations right through the town of Montauk, just kept going west. And the eastern area was totally devoid of animal life, including birds, for years. When we took these series of pictures in '93 with the crew there, we found evidence of returning life with a lot of cats. Next slide. And they seem to be doing quite well. Tourists fed them, I presume. They even found a deer or two. I didn't get pictures of them. So the animal life was starting to move in. The operation of the original Montauk Station, which was first from the tower and then from the underground, but during the days when they operated from the tower, the RF fields that came out of there were so high and level they had literally changed the weather when operational on the eastern end of the island. People couldn't stand what they felt. They abandoned their homes and moved out. And there were cases where on a summer's day in July, the temperature normally 85 degrees, and in a half hour would drop to 32 degrees and would start to snow. In 1/2 hour. That was due to the influence of Montauk. That doesn't occur anymore. The original operations in Montauk for the time tunnel operations are over. The Montauk Boys program, which I will get into if we finish these couple of slides, is something you really need to know about, because it's no longer local operation, it's worldwide. Let's get in a little bit more to some of the other programs. As I said, the time travel came from the Germans, and we did our own versions of it, and the aliens helped us. Their purpose for that was to create the condition whereby on the 12th of August, '83, the Montauk Station, which had been on since about 1 August, continuous. Normally, it only ran about a couple of hours every second or third day for some experiment, maybe up to 8 hours, but then it would be shut down. 1 August, the orders came through from somewhere that it was to go online and stay online until further orders. So it ran all these days, about 12 of them, and was on, of course, when the time period for the lockup with the Philadelphia experiment occurred. It created a tremendous rift in space-time, and that was deliberately designed by the aliens for one reason and one purpose. And that was to create the rift in space-time and allow large numbers of alien craft to come through of various types and inhabit the Earth's atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, and invade Earth. Bill Schneider used to tell me the story, and in fact I have the pictures of it. They're not in the slide form. I've got them in prints, and they're not here, except a couple of them. That the aliens started moving in large numbers, and in 1945, late 45 and early 46, they found a huge operational base of UFOs in the Pacific under one of the atolls. It happened to be Eniwetok. July 46, we had the atomic bomb test called Operation Crossroads, completely open to the public. There were some civilian observers, and it was well covered in the news media, in which we were going to set off a series of atomic bombs above water level and at water level and maybe one under water level to see what the effect would be on Navy ships, both American and captured German ships. We conducted these tests. There was 4 total. If I remember correctly, the public media at the time only mentioned 2. But the special photographs they made, and they had some very good cameras and some very good photographs, at the time of the neutron flash of the first one of these atomic explosions, you could see, thank you, you could see, something's going on here, devices leaving the ocean floor, which you could clearly see in the original photos were UFOs. They were all airbrushed out for the public releases. It was estimated by the intelligence community at that time that there were some 500,000 UFOs in a very large underwater base. And that was what they attempted to destroy and did destroy. The Japanese had problems with aliens invading their terrain. And according to Phil Schneider, who got this information, his father, Oscar Schneider, at the time of the dropping of the first atomic bomb, of course it's historically, the one on Hiroshima is historically known, of course the Japanese military didn't believe it. They didn't believe that one bomb could do so much damage. Hirohito, who was then the emperor, was quite aware of what was going on. And the next target, which was publicly announced by our leaflets, was going to be Nagasaki, and that of course we would keep dropping bombs on the Japanese cities till they surrendered. He knew it was coming. He allowed, according to the information that was given to me, the Americans to go ahead and drop their bomb on Nagasaki, because Nagasaki was in the process of being taken over by aliens. It's only taking it out of the hands of the Japanese government. So he sacrificed the city in order to get rid of the aliens. And then he told his military people, you will surrender now. And they did. The rest is history, except for a few other things. The Montauk Boys program, which of course had no connection with this Japanese operation, is a continuation of the research done by German scientists, and also, I might add, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who came from Europe in the 40s, about 43, came to the United States, set up his operation at Rangeley, Maine about 46, 47, and then signed a contract with the new CIA to do research for them on mind control, mind manipulation, primarily according to their version, that is the CIA version of the contract, that they were interested in finding ways of, quote, deprogramming people, unquote, and also developing enhanced psychic abilities. Well, Wilhelm Reich bought it, started his research, went through about 2.5 years of it. It was a 5-year contract with the notebooks, which were turned over to NSA, and then suddenly realized somehow that he hadn't been told the whole story. What they really wanted was mind control techniques, and they wanted him to find out how you can do it. He did find out the most basic elements of what makes the human mind function in terms of the conscious mind level and the subconscious mind level. Most of your memories are buried in the subconscious. The, shall we say, subconscious command functions, which control most people in one way or another, regardless of how you got this information buried in your subconscious, are there. How do you access it? That's what he found out. He found that at the point of orgasm, the conscious mind locks up with the subconscious mind for a brief period, and you can transfer information either way. The trick was to sustain that point before the actual orgasm so that the conscious and subconscious minds could be linked for a controlled period of time in order to put instructions in through the conscious mind into the subconscious, either adding a programming function or taking one out or whatever they wanted to do. He found out how to do it, and the trick of how to sustain that condition was, of course, the later research after he left the program. The history states that he was charged in court with violation of something or other. He was supposed to make a court appearance in 1954. He refused to show up, says you can't legislate science. And the judge let him get away with it at that point. Then in 1956 he was hauled up on charges again. And of course the charges were concealed in terms of what was really going on. The Greada Treaty was signed in 54. In 56 he was down in Tucson using one of his modified cloudbusters to shoot down UFOs. It was an absolute no-no. And he didn't know it, but he got arrested. And in the court hearing, which I read in the notes, the judge was leaning over backwards to try and find some excuse to not send him to prison, because he said, if I go to prison, I'll probably die there. I got a heart condition, I need regular medication, etc., etc. The judge kept asking him, well, what have you been doing? He says, I can't tell you. It's classified. Oh, who have you been working with? He says, well, finally he admitted he was working with the Air Force. And so what's the project? I simply can't tell you. And he never gave the judge any more information, so he went to prison, and he died in prison. Come up to the 70s, and Preston Nichols, digging around in these various swap meets. He didn't tell me the exact year it happened, but digging around these swap meets, kept turning up some of Reich's old equipment, the orgone energy accumulators and this sort of thing, at the swap meets in New Hampshire, in Connecticut, and particularly in New Hampshire. And on one occasion he asked one of the people who was selling this stuff, he says, where'd you get it? He says, well, he said, I've gotten it from one of the old Wilhelm Reich homes. He has several homes in the New England area. He says, if you go up to this particular location and ask for the caretaker, he'll probably show you some more. He said, there's quite a lot of stuff left in that house. And Preston got very interested. He went up to the house and saw the caretaker, and showed him around and what equipment was still around. And then casually the caretaker mentioned, well, there's notebooks. Preston says, notebooks? I want to see those. He looked at them. They were in Wilhelm Reich's handwriting. There was a whole series of notebooks from about 1950, late 50 into 52, outlining and detailing some of his experiments. And he says, how much do you want for them? He says, make an offer. So Preston made an offer and bought them, took them home. He realized he had something very hot in terms of the information, but he wasn't at that point sure what it was. A month goes by and he gets a call from NSA, National Security Agency. We understand you have some of Wilhelm Reich's notebooks. He says, yes, I bought them legally and they're mine. He says, well, we want them. You can't have them. He says, well, we'll have to tell you the rest of the story. He says, Wilhelm Reich, of course, was on contract for 5 years, and about halfway through, the notebooks he wrote no longer contained accurate information, and they were falsified. He says, we have reason to believe you have the true notebooks. The President says, okay, so what? He says, well, we need them. Well, they argued back and forth, and the deal was struck. And the deal was basically that the NSA would provide him with copies of the first half of the notebooks he did not have, as long as Preston would supply NSA with the second half copies of the notebooks, so they would both have complete sets. And of course, part of the agreement was that under no circumstances was he ever to show those notebooks to anyone else for the rest of his life. And he's never shown them to anyone else, so far as I know. But he's quoted extensively from them to me. And with that, he had Wilhelm Reich secrets for manipulating people's minds and programming, which is what the CIA wanted. And that information was basically used in the Montauk Boys program at a later date. That plus all the other information in which they were programmed. The original programming techniques were physical and brutal. Later on, it turned into an electronic system where they could do it electronically by putting electrodes on your head and your body at various points and sex organs, and they could induce the proper state and then by computer feed in the information they wanted to program this kid. And they always chose them around puberty, and which meant anywhere from the age of 12 to 16, sometimes as high as 17, though they usually never went that high. They would pull these kids in first off of Long Island, then it was off the streets of New York, and then eventually, because of the Montauk operation, they could pick them from anywheres. And they took them from the West Coast and various cities. They looked for derelict kids and street kids who had no links or no parents they could trace and didn't care whether they could or not, but the parent, they could run away. They were strictly runaways and living off the streets. So we pull them in, they would program them, and then send them back to where they were. Early on I was asked if I would run the program, and I said, I don't know, let's see what it's all about. When I saw what it was all about, I said, there ain't no way, no how I'm going to have any part with that program. About 1980, in the phase I mentioned where this guy was beating them into submission, I got the idea there was a much better way to do this, and I went up the ranks and finally all the way up to almost the top administrative levels, which were outside of Montauk. Saw a certain person there and told him my proposal to do all of this electronically, and instead of beating them into submission, put a carrot in front of their nose, offer them something to entice them to be part of the program. Most of them were kids with no money, no homes, no nothing. Offer them, if they will go through the program and complete it, a bank account, money to live decently, money to go to school with, get an education. They would be encouraged to get an education to whatever level they wanted, including PhD if they thought they could do it. Eventually, of course, they become part of society and work for a living, at which point there was no more feeding of their bank account. They would never remember, of course, after leaving the program, they'd been part of it. It would be totally erased. But the inbuilt program was buried in the subconscious, which could be triggered by a phone call, by a radio transmitted message, because Preston proved it could be done that way. The human brain is a receptor of scalar energy, and transmitters, the tube type, will emit scalar energy signals. And he proved it one day, some years ago. Set up a little transmitter on the island, about 250 watts, fed with a tape recorder, repeating this message over and over. If you hear this message, call such and such phone number. The phone number happened to be that of a friend of his, where they put an answering machine. In 3 days, they got over 600 phone calls from Connecticut, or actually from Maine, on down to Florida. It turned out there was only about 200 actual persons involved. There were some repeats. But then, of course, the transmitter was seized by parties unknown. But he proved his point. You could contact these people who had been previously programmed by a radio transmission. They hear it in their head. No radio receiver. The human brain will pick up these scalar energies as long as your brain is functioning in a normal manner. So he proved the point. This is one of the ways to contact the Montauk boys. Well, they cranked them out, and they cranked them out, and then the program was moved out of Montauk. And at that point, we pretty well lost it as to what was going on and where it was going. We knew it was going on somewhere yet. Son Morgan, whom I mentioned, number 2 son, was living last January in the 6-bedroom house in Sag Harbor, which is past Amagansett, Sag Harbor, Long Island, which is fairly close to Montauk. And he was in the process of being deprogrammed by Preston. And in the process of doing this, I found out he was, without question, a Montauk boy. They started to get rid of some of the programs. And he remembered a connection with an underground base, which was under Sag Harbor, and part of it was right under the house he was living in and I was staying in, etc. Preston, at that point, was a member of the Air Force intelligence community, and still is. He was reinducted back into the Air Force about a year and a half ago. He gets in contact with his superiors and tells them about this. They get interested. The next thing you know, the Air Force raids this base underground, pulls out the records, and some of the personnel running it had very strange gray uniforms with no name badges, some rank bars, and some strange red twill type of markings on the shoulders. And the records. 30,000 Montauk boys have been processed through that one base alone. They had full dossiers, histories of each individual, and photographs. But what got very interesting was what else they found in the office. These guys they captured, they knew nothing. The higher level authorities, apparently running the thing from another level, were not there or escaped, as the case may be. They found some interesting artifacts. Pen and pencil sets were marked on them, a cross, typically in gold, and on top of it a red rose. The Order of the Rosy Cross, you know who that is? Rosicrucian Order. They found connections to the Palatine monks. They found connections to the Knights of Malta. And as he told me on the phone, I wouldn't tell me the whole story till I got there in person, he said this thing is a cult-like operation. We don't know who's running it, but somebody is, and hiding behind various religious orders. And has apparently been ongoing for some time. And the Air Force raided that base and closed it down. There were severe repercussions to Preston over this. I won't go into the details, but he survived it. They've since raided 30 to 40 more bases. They found out there were 6 on Long Island. That was number 1 they knocked out, or left 5 operational. We don't know how many in the U.S. totally, but what has come up in the way of figures that processed, programmed, and ready to go, if you will, Montauk boys. And it's not merely Montauk boys. There's a Montauk girls program also, but they seem to be a very small number, at least so far as we can determine. The military estimates there's at least, and this is a conservative estimate, at least 5 million programmed Montauk boys in the United States alone. And the evidence showed from those records, from that one base alone, not only was my now dead roommate Peter L. Sokol on that list with his photograph, but all kinds of people, including a recruit brought in from Australia to Montauk. I don't know who it was. What do these kids do when they've got their buttons pushed and are in operating mode? As when I ran the latter part of that program, I could never find out what they were supposed to be used for. I did find out that the target dates for their use was 95, 96, 97. Look in the news here, and of course you may or may not read U.S. newspapers or hear much about what goes on in the U.S., but there's a lot of massacres, mass murders. The one very famous guy recently who took out the Italian clothing designer in Miami, he got an awful lot of press coverage. I took one look at that photo and it says, Montauk boy. The guys who knew him, that he lived with before this massacre started, said he was a quiet, gentle guy. They could never believe that he was capable of this sort of thing. A string of murders across the country, then take out this Italian designer. It was determined this guy was homosexual, and the Italian designer was homosexual, and a number of his friends admitted to it that he lived with. That's not the point. The point is he was directed to go on a shooting spree, if you will, and maybe directed to take out the Italian director or clothing designer, I don't know. But he did take him out. Then, of course, the final orders are, do yourself in, which he did. They don't want these guys captured. Many massacres like that. You had one over here recently. I don't know whether it's a case like that or not. Yeah, it's still being kicked around. But there's been many of these in the U.S. There have been massacres. There have been shootings in schoolyards by people that come up to a schoolyard fence, take out a rifle or a shotgun and go bang, 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 bang. No excuse, no reason. They don't know these people. They do it in restaurants, cafeterias. This is all Montauk boy programming, and these kids were no longer kids. Because if they were processed in the period up, let's say, through 83, is 14 years older. If, say, they were 12 then, they're now 26. And this programming has not stopped. I mentioned this to Phil Schneider, my late friend, one time about the Montauk Boys program. He sort of screwed up his face a little. He said, this smacks of pedophilia to me. I says, it is possible you could call it that. But he went on his own investigation. He lived in Portland, Oregon. He went to the local police department, told them what he knew about it. He says, what do you know about this program? The police told him, it's best you not stick your nose in affairs that do not concern you. He got incensed. He went to the FBI, a local FBI in Portland, Oregon. He asked them about it. He got a senior member in the office, been there over 20 years. He says, we know all about it. He says, you know all about it? What are you doing about it? He says, nothing. He says, why not? He says, we can't. Our hands are tied. And then threw some statistics at him, which are rather frightening. He says, of course, you know about the missing kids and all of this on the milk cartons and on the little cards you get in the mail and all this sort of thing. It says our statistics show that in the United States alone, about 2 million kids disappear a year. Of that, about 1 million relocate or find out what happened to them, so it's written off in the records. The other 1 million, we never find out what happened to them. And this has been going on for 20 years or more. That's 20 million kids lost, unaccounted for. If half of them wound up in the Montauk Boys program, there would be about 10 million that are prepared for whatever, which in looking at the LA fires and riots some years ago, arson, murder, mayhem, spying of some kind or other, who knows what. You can guess and figure it out pretty well as to what they might be used for. My estimate was 10 million in the U.S. And we found out this operation, with only the one location we found on Long Island, eventually able to nail down the name of the group running it, and we still cannot get any data on it. It's called the Meridian Group. They operate out of West Virginia. And who's sponsoring them, how it's run, we don't know, but we've been finding out is no longer locally restricted to the United States. It's a worldwide operation in which we do not have much data. But it's ongoing, it has not stopped, and they're building up a vast army, a secret army of some kind for some purpose. They have military people in on this that have looked at it and they're quite concerned. One person, a friend of mine who I can't name, is in intelligence, knows a fair amount about it. He says, yes, I know about it, and we know that it's involving humans at the top level and the bottom level, but in between is an old alien group in the middle, which is very heavily involved in this program. Can't prove that, but that was his statement, and I can't reveal who he is because of its position. But he knew a fair amount about the program. He says, we're trying to break it up. It is not an easy task. Montauk girls are programmed to do essentially the same things, except the girls can be programmed for sexual seduction and what have you, much more than the boys, because while the early Montauk boys program, about 70% were programmed homosexual, they found out that doesn't work very well. Psychically, if the two guys get together as homosexuals and do their thing, they very much force the raising of the Kundalini energy, and if you get enough Kundalini energy flowing, you deprogram yourself. So they wound up that the kids were deprogramming themselves. They didn't want that. So now they're almost all programmed heteros, regardless of what their natural inclinations would be, and we get together, the world that just locks in the program. It doesn't release it. We don't know the whole story or what they want to use them for, but we've been seeing some evidence. On my last trip in Long Island indicated that the Montauk boys were being activated on Long Island. Now you might ask, as a layman or a laywoman, how do you spot one? How do you know that somebody is a Montauk boy? It's a generic term because they're programmed all over. The programming techniques are the same. The, shall I say, the signature which is left on an individual is distinct, if you know how to read it, for each location. There very commonly, a commonality exists between them, but there's a little bit of difference between them as whether they're programmed in Long Island or Michigan or California, like Los Angeles, for example, or wherever. There's two ways you can spot them. One, if you're psychic enough to read auras, you will see around that person who has been so programmed, and it remains with them for the rest of their life unless they are deprogrammed, a black wavy aura which will have a very strange structure to it. It won't be clean black like just a straight outline. It will have a zigzag type structure, much like the edge of a picture puzzle, the raw edge on the inside. The other way is if you are an expert at reading body language, you can spot the person that way. Preston happens to be an expert at body language, and he has almost no psychic ability, but he says he can spot a Montauk boy instantly just by their body language. Anyone who's been programmed, the body says, literally, I've been programmed. And if you know what to look for, you can tell that that person has been programmed, how they may have been programmed, maybe not for what purpose, but how they were programmed. You may not be able to read where, but you can tell that that person is programmed as a Montauk boy and has certain restrictions imposed on him mentally, which shows up physically in the body language. If that person is not programmed, the body language will not show something that is not there. So if you want to go learn how to read body language, it might be helpful. I've seen a few around Brisbane. Let's say the percentage of Montauk boys here is low compared to the LA area, or where I've been in Denver. It isn't to the point now in some of the American cities. The question is not how many have been programmed as Montauk boys. The question is who escaped it. And there's not many. It's a very serious problem. It represents a secret army that somebody's getting ready for something. It's sort of a somber note, but nevertheless I felt you needed the information. Now there are other things which we can go into. There is one other aspect I do want to go into very briefly, then I'll open it up for questions. The business of time travel is something which, of course, our government, and I'm sure other governments, got into quite far back. I found, and this was really probably the primary reason for my being kicked out of Los Alamos laboratories and the treatment they gave me to wipe my memories. Up there in the vault, I found references to a program called Project Southern Cross. Now, Preston had made allusions to this for some time to me, and just didn't register. He said it was a program of time travel. Well, certain things triggered, and all of a sudden I remembered my digging through the vaults and coming up with this Project Southern Cross, and of course I had a big mouth when I would talk with other personnel, usually officers, and then 46, 47, mostly civilian people up there, about what I saw in the vault. Basically, Project Southern Cross was this. Back about 1936, there was some exploration being done in the South Atlantic, just north of the coast of Venezuela, across the equator, so that it was in the area which is called the Southern Cross. When they say under the Southern Cross, of course they're referring to the constellation Southern Cross down there, which is visible in the southern hemisphere. A brand new carrier called the Kearsarge, USS Kearsarge, was exploring around that area, which is the fringe area of the Bermuda Triangle, and they found a very strange crystal formation on the ocean floor, quite large, seemingly one piece. And they were exploring it, I presume sending divers down on it. I didn't read all of the details of this report, and I don't remember all the details now. But in the process of doing this, a modern warship has, of course, all kinds of electromagnetic emanations, magnetic generation of fields internally in the ship, and so forth. All of a sudden, the ship disappeared. It was no longer there in that location. It came back later, and I assumed that they found out what the problem was and were able to reverse engineer the problem and come back. I had inputs which stated very flatly that no, they didn't know what happened, and no, the people in the future, they weren't in the future, had to help them reverse the equipment so they get back to where they started and give them some clues as to how to calibrate it. In short, by 1938, they had the system calibrated, and they found in the process there were these crystalline formations on the ocean floor all over the world. They were Atlantean. They were originally used by the Atlanteans not so much for time travel as they were used for moving heavy cargo on barges from point A to point B instantaneously with the proper excitation of the crystal formation. I don't know how it works, but it worked, and they were still working. So our government found out how to calibrate this system for time travel. So the Kearsarge became part of it. As I recall, the data, the USS Eldridge became part of it, and they were using this to go into the future. When I found out about this, and of course the secret part of what they were using it for was literally to win World War II. The Germans were winning it hands down in 1943. They had technology far beyond us. They had rocket planes that didn't put into production. They had jet aircraft that had been in production since 1939, 1940. They already had an atomic bomb they didn't use. And they had, of course, these Foo Fighters and circular foil aircraft with anti-gravity drives, and that was the real threat. The Allies were tearing their hair out, and of course those who were in back of them, which we can now call the New World Order, had decided there was no way that the world was going to be dictated to by the Thule Society or the elements of the German society involved with that whole operation. They went into the future, most literally, and brought back hardware, military hardware, communications hardware. Preston can tell a story about that, being personally involved in it. Strange gyros, I have photos of them. They were obviously built in the 60s or 70s, yet they had a manufacturing date on the inside of the box dating June 6, 1928. You look at it with plastic wiring, fiberboard fiberglass boards for mounting components, a tiny little sphere in the center for the gyro, which is modern design, runs at 100,000 RPM. The regular stuff built in the 20s and 28 had a gyro inside about that big, air-driven at about 30,000 RPM, and it was lucky if the thing didn't blow up. Look at this sort of stuff. So what the blazes is going on here? That was only a few examples, but Preston's data was that we brought a lot of hardware back from the future to win the war, including large amounts of plutonium. When the test was made at Trinity Flats, Nevada on June 17, 1946, of what was alleged to be the first working atomic bomb, it was a plutonium device. It wasn't the first. It was the second successful test, but it was the first one with plutonium. It took all of the plutonium that we had in stock from the production facilities at that time, which were turning out a rather meager amount, and it took about 15 kilograms to produce a working bomb with the implosion type principle. It worked very well. We had no more plutonium. Suddenly we're dropping bombs on Japan. First one was alleged to be the old gun barrel type, about 10 tons, where they bring 2 large charges of uranium-235, which we had lots of, and you bring it together very fast, and in a gun barrel with explosion, it holds together a certain amount of time, and it goes through the fission number and produces an atomic explosion. Wasteful, inefficient, but it certainly worked. Second bomb was allegedly plutonium bomb, and they kept going after that. There were 2 more apparently dropped from what Preston found out. Tactical nuclear weapons, which is a totally different design using plutonium, on Tokyo. No wonder Hirohito ordered the military to surrender in a hurry. We had large amounts of plutonium available to us at that time. And who knows what else. We won the war. And of course the German military bowed out, and they were forced out, and then they retreated to Antarctica to a prepared base, and that's another long story we don't have time to go into, but they lost the war politically, but they never lost it militarily. It's a very good question.
Could you repeat the question, please?
The question is the Church of Scientology involved with this boys program, possibly the Montauk boys program, because they are recruiting a lot of young boys into the current program? Briefly, a history of the Church of Scientology goes back to L. Ron Hubbard. His real name was Wilson. He was not a Hubbard. It was an adopted name. And he and Jack Parsons, he was the man who founded JPL, Jack Parsons Laboratory of Solid Rockets, were friends. They were both in naval intelligence. They both left the Navy in '46. They remained friends through that period afterwards until Parsons died in an explosion in his lab the night before he and his wife were going to go to Europe, and he was going to abandon the operations in the U.S. They did a lot of things together. Hubbard did not found the Church of Scientology, as I remember the data, until 1954. He had prior operations. And the question is, did he program boys? He claimed all along, when he was alive, and what they've been doing since, I don't know. Well, when he was alive, he wanted to deprogram people, everyone. And he took a lot of young kids. In Phoenix, Arizona, he was thrown out of Phoenix because he took 4 young kids in their teens without parental permission and was deprogramming them around the clock in his facility there. I know this because of certain people who were there at the time who left. He fled by plane and he left his son to clean up the business, and then he moved back to either Newark or Washington. He was doing a lot of deprogramming. So far as I know, one of the earlier programs and under L. Ron Hubbard's control, he was sincerely interested in deprogramming people and giving them back to themselves. But at the same time, there were other people who went through the programs at that time, and speaking of the 50s, 60s, who insisted that there was a lot of deprogramming followed by reprogramming to lock you into the church as a group gestalt, if you will, a group mental control. And if you tried to break out of the church after that, you were in serious trouble. The ethics committees came after you. Sometimes you wound up dead. Sometimes you wound up being dragged back into the church. I'm telling tales out of school. I was not a member of the church, but I know a lot of people who were, and that's the info I've had. Currently, I do not know what their goals are because Hubbard's dead. Quentin committed suicide, which is a no-no in the church, and there was nobody else to take it over. John Hubbard resigned and quit and wrote lengthy damning articles in Penthouse magazine years ago. So I don't know where the church really stands today in that respect. But the fact that they are recruiting young boys is highly suspicious, is all I can say as an answer. In view of their past history, it's questionable what they are doing now. I have no inputs on the current operations because it's under totally new control. Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Your understanding that your knowledge of any of the underground work in Canada out of Pine Gap, and also do you have any knowledge of the possibility of if and when, as far as general public being allowed general access to new technology?
Operations at Pine Gap, what do I know about that? And the underground. I know a little of it, and that of course has been a vast amount of speculation on the whole operation out there. It is U.S. government controlled totally. The Australian government has kept out. They gave them very generously that area after the war when the U.S. government asked for it as a military base. And now they've kept everybody out, including American military and civilians who do not have access, plus the need to know, and are actually invited out. The American military tried to fly in with hang gliders to get in. They got in past 50 miles and they were intercepted and stopped. They said if you go on the rest of the way to the inner perimeter, you would never get out again. You would never see the light of day outside of this area. What is going on is a lot of speculation. What information I have, part of it is speculative, and part of it is fairly solid reports. This is a vast underground operation. They've bored a hole down 30, 40, 50 miles. Huge hole. There's all kinds of operations manufacturing special materials and equipments in a gravity neutral zone. So this gets into the business of the theory of what is the Earth really. The ancients said, and there are those today saying that the Earth is hollow. It has a hollow inner core. Consequently, the ideas of what happens to gravity are vastly different than it would be if it had a solid core. So if you have a shell, you have a certain amount of gravity. Let's call it gravity force 1 because it's a relative number, but call it number 1. As you go down towards the core, which means you go down into the shell, at some point you're going to hit a neutral zone because on the inside of that shell, on the inside, there is another gravity field which sustains the people or objects on the inside up against the shell, upside down if you will, but nevertheless sustained in there. And apparently, and I can't prove this, there is a central sun. At least that's what a lot of the theories go. I haven't seen this and was heavy on this. A lot of other people have been. But you will reach a gravity neutral zone. And if you get to the gravity neutral zone, you can process elements which you cannot do in a gravity field. NASA takes a lot of stuff out into space where there's essentially a gravity neutral zone to process certain elements that are required in certain operations. And apparently, I can only say it as apparent, they're doing much the same thing there. What else they may be doing, who knows. I do know that Henry Kissinger was a heavy visitor out there. He's called out periodically. He may not be now, but in years gone by he was. As one of the heavyweights in the New World government, in the New World Order. Apparently he had reason to be out there. I hope that answers your question, at least in part.
ET involvement, possibly?
I'm sorry?
ET involvement, possibly? Extraterrestrial.
Kissinger, you mean?
Extraterrestrial involvement.
Oh, extraterrestrial. I don't know. I would consider it likely, but I don't know.
And part 2 of the question, sorry.
Because they've been involved in so many other things. It would seem logical that extraterrestrials would be involved in the Pine Gap operation, but I don't know if they are or not. Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman here.
You mentioned that when the nuclear explosion, the first one went off and killed or destroyed 500,000 ships or thereabouts.
You've got a train going by outside. I can barely hear you.
You mentioned when the first You mentioned when the first nuclear explosions were tested in the ocean, and there was something like 500,000 alien ships underneath the water. Are we currently, or were we involved with some sort of war against another alien nation?
That's a good question. Are we involved in a war against others, perhaps extraterrestrials? In general, we could say yes. The problem with this is it's been an ongoing war for thousands of years under our feet between different alien groups. Information I have, which is again via Phil Schneider and what he dug out as a geologist having extremely high level clearance in the U.S. government. He said the first alien contact by U.S. government forces didn't occur in World War II or right after it. He said it occurred in 1908. And I said, what were the circumstances? He says there was a military force pursuing some outlaws in the southwestern desert, probably New Mexico, and they ran them up against a wall. There seemed to be a cave there. These desperados went in the cave, and the military, the U.S. Army forces, followed them in the cave. And what did they find in there? A couple of nice circular foil aircraft with aliens. So that got reported back to Washington, I'm sure. And how many other reports we may have like that, I don't know. But currently, there is a massive problem. The particle beam weapon system, which was developed initially and first by Nikola Tesla, and he tried to sell it to the various governments before World War II. Nobody would buy it except the Russians, and they paid him $25,000 for a working model and papers and a year's consultancy. After the war was over, it was sort of abandoned. Then suddenly the Russians are using it, and suddenly the American military wakes up, and then they suddenly decide we've got a real problem. They've got the Star Wars Initiative program, which is basically designed not for shooting down missiles coming at us, let's say from Russia or vice versa, but it was basically designed for action against aliens and alien invasion. That is the whole purpose of the Star Wars Initiative. It was never intended to be used against other humans or other human countries. The platforms that are up there will do various things, but the most powerful weapons are on the ground. Montauk having been the primary point for developing this. It's a Tesla designed and originally a Tesla idea of a particle beam weapon system, but they've taken it to unbelievable lengths. They found out how to generate a form of energy multiplication which is correctly in accordance with Einstein's theories. If you accelerate a particle up to virtually the speed of light, its mass will increase by several orders of magnitude. They take it up to about 4 orders of magnitude. First with a circular cyclotron-like track generator, then through a tunnel to a second one, then through a tunnel to the 2 final stages, which are linear accelerators 5 miles long under the ocean. The output power of that beam is calculated as anywhere between 1 times 10 to the 23rd joules and 1 times 10 to the 24th joules. That's much more power than a hydrogen bomb. And this beam can be focused, and there's 36 of them around the planet now, can be focused out in space, and they can do multiple focusing with several of them. But it is a twin beam because it is essentially transmitted out in what would probably be best called a scalar form, and scalar energy forms, if you follow the theory on this, much of which comes from an American sitting in down in Huntsville, Alabama. You cross a beam at some point, you generate a more standard electronic or electromagnetic energy form, and since it's already so high, in the crossing it creates an enormous explosion, and there's nothing that can resist that. A spaceship with field force shields around it or anything else. They've been shooting down UFOs in this country and in Russia at an enormous rate. They set up a, so we say, a perimeter. My understanding is it's 250 miles out. Nobody comes in past that point without being invited by the U.S. government or the Russian government. They're the primary ones doing this. Phil said when he was traveling as a native geologist and went through Russia, he said they had football fields of junk from shot down UFOs. They were shooting them down at the rate of 30 a week. And we're shooting them down at the rate of 5 to 7 a week. You don't care who they are. The attitude now is, if you come in here and we didn't tell you it's okay to come in here, we don't care whether you're friend or foe, you're shot down. And they have shot down friendlies. There is a sort of war going on. It's mostly out there, but it may come down to earth. We don't know, and this is what they're worried about. They're letting everybody know we can shoot you down. Stay out there. Keep your war out there. By Nicholas' own office, and his real name you couldn't pronounce. They are all telepathic, but in terms of communicating with humans, so they know most of them are not telepathic. They use perfectly ordinary vocal cords and speech. Some of their vocal cords are not exactly the same pitch as humans, but they can communicate verbally in virtually any language. And English, of course, there was the chosen language, because it is our language. Yes, they communicated, and we could learn, and we did learn a lot from them. And there are other aliens of various other projects we've learned a lot from. The status of medical research has been greatly accelerated. We're today at the point of not only gene splicing, but literally computing the entire genome and creating artificial life. In other words, our scientists are at the point of doing the God number, creating life forms, playing God. They're already doing it to an extent, namely modifying genetically people, growing third limbs on them and other crazy things in the underground horror labs and what I've heard of. I've never seen them, but I know people who have. That's one aspect. They have, of course, time travel available. They have anti-gravity drive ships available. They've been building them for years. Patterns perhaps initially after the Germans. That today, as let's say of about 1986, they built a very large starship. How large I don't know, but it's very much like the Star Trek design. The large crew has gone all over the galaxy, and I'm told beyond. So we have the capability. A lot of the smaller versions of these anti-gravity ships are used by our military for transport of special military personnel. I've had eyewitness reports from ex-intelligence people, particularly over in Saudi Arabia area and the area where the Gulf War was held in Iran, not just Iran, but in the other section, the other countries that he saw personally. Ships come down the size of a football field, silent, no wings, drop off 75 or 100 American military personnel that went into an underground bunker, and then the ship took off. It was distinctly American. So we have the technology, and it's not restricted to the U.S. I mean, this kind of technology is shared undoubtedly with UK, with the Russians, who else, I don't know. But we have it. Yes, you have a question.
Could you tell us a little bit about there's a case Richard Hoagland put on back end of his video, the UFO that was coming down the coast of Australia, and with the two flashes came out and shot at it and shot off into space. Do you know that case?
You're referring to a specific video, I think, which was called SDS-48. It was a NASA video which was captured by somebody on the ground showing what you described of an object moving across the horizon at high speed and something firing at it from the ground, and it made a right angle turn and went out into space. Dr. Hoagland got a hold of a copy of that, and he analyzed the speeds involved, and he said he found some benchmarks and points on the ground for reference. And he said before the attempted hit, it was moving across the horizon at a rate of what he estimated was something between 150 to 200,000 miles an hour. Then came the thing firing at it, which was probably ground-based. It made the right angle turn. He says it took off very fast, like 400,000 miles an hour. Those were his figures and his analysis. I have or had an original copy of that, but it shows in one part of it very clearly circular foil aircraft in broad daylight, photographed from that particular flight. And it's a very interesting fact that right after that videotape came out and that flight was completed, the then director of NASA was retired, and somebody else was put in. They suspect that he allowed this information to be leaked, so he was retired. Yes, you have a question.
In regards to that, it's been put forward as a theory that the craft in fact
bend space to achieve those speeds?
That is one of the theories, yes, bending in space.
Well, if that was true, wouldn't that therefore theoretically make it practically impossible to direct a beam at the craft to actually disable it then, if it is bending space in the process?
It's a very interesting observation. Wouldn't, if somebody, a ship, were able to fold space to go from point A to point B instantaneously, if a beam weapon were fired at them, maybe it wouldn't hit them. Well, if they moved out of our space fast enough like that, yes, it would not hit them. That's very true. That's one of the stated means of propulsion by some of these UFOs is like you take a long strip of paper, point A, point B, you fold the paper, the 2 points come together. If you fold space, you can do the same thing. Now, allegedly, some of the alien groups, the more advanced ones, can do this. Most of them use hyperspace travel, which means at speeds beyond the speed of light, which is more common. But either way, if they move fast enough, no, the beam won't hit them, because the beam is limited to slightly less than the speed of light. Depending on how much energy they put into it, it will not travel at the speed of light. It would be under it. Because it is not a light beam, it is a particle beam system. Therefore, it is restricted to less than c. Yes, you have a question there?
What's your opinion of Stargate? Is that really about trying to teleport the planet?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
What's your opinion of Stargate? Is that really about trying to teleport the planet?
It's very interesting you bring that up. And what is my opinion about Stargate? There was a movie, of course, by that name, some years ago. I presume it was over here, alleging the recovery of some ancient hardware in the desert in Egypt and the military setting it up, finding out how it would work, and going somewhere else with it to another, perhaps another universe where there's another war going on. Quite different area, but with humans. Information I have from people who are connected with that program said Stargate was real. There was recovered hardware. The military did use it. They did go somewhere else with it. Bill Schneider, before he died, replicated on miniature size what it appeared to be a Stargate phenomenon, namely that circular area where you got that watery-like view of something you can literally penetrate. He had recreated in a lab with some other people, from what he told me. I never saw it, but he told me that he did this. And he put his arm through it and almost got it sucked in. And he said when he got it back out, because he hung onto the table and some other things were quite solid, got it back out, he said he had a burning sensation in that left arm for the rest of his life. He didn't go through the whole thing, and it may not have been set up right, for all I know. Now, my sources insist that that was a real project and it was done by the military. To what end and what purpose, I don't know. Yes, ma'am, you have a question.
To what extent is Project Sanguine being used as a cover with the ELFs, the actual real Project Sanguine? Are they using the ELF frequencies to disrupt alien?
Project Sanguine, is it a cover, or is it real, or what is it being used for? Sanguine, if I remember right, was one of the ELF communication systems used years ago. Yes, it is in essence still being used, but much of the Project Sanguine ELF transmissions have been sort of abandoned because A, they needed too much power, B, they needed gigantic antenna farms, and the Navy already has other systems which will communicate with the submarines underwater worldwide. If they're going to use low-frequency modulation, there are other ways of doing it. They can put it on an RF carrier and put the transmitter virtually in a suitcase if the frequency is high enough, and it'll still be ELF transmissions in terms of what effects it may have on you neurologically, or in terms of its transmission characteristics. It still somewhat resembles the earlier ELF, but it's not the same wavelength. The original long wavelength which they desired was because of the fact that in the near field phenomena you would be around the Earth and you couldn't get outside the field. Well, that was one of the problems. You couldn't. And it caused enormous physiological problems in the vicinity of the antenna fields. They were ordered to shut down by one or two state governments in the U.S. and as far as I know the project as such is essentially abandoned because it's been replaced by HAARP.
Well, that's good about that.
Yeah, HAARP. Or as Mr. Nick Begich likes to say, angels don't play this harp. HARP standing, of course, for High Altitude Atmospheric Research Program, which is ongoing. A talk with Begich about 2 weeks ago as he was at a Denver conference. And as he said, the program is essentially shut down during the summer for maintenance, repairs, and modification. They said they're modifying it now to boost the power output level to 1 gigawatt. And they're doing it with high gain antennas, and they said the final goal is to run it up to about 3.5 gigawatts. My only comment is, what do they want to do, destroy the ionosphere? I mean, this is unbelievable power levels. They don't need that much power for weather mod. What else are they trying to do? Of course, one of the things that's come up between communications between Nick Begich and Preston Nichols, Preston got some modulation waveforms from Nick from his observations on the Alaska end of the transmissions from HARP, and it turns out the modulation waveforms are identical to what Montauk was using in the days when they were doing mind control work. So HARP has more than one function. It appears that it can be used, and probably is being used, for mind manipulation. When you say mind control, you have to use that term advisedly because it doesn't mean necessarily rigid control. All you need to do is get mood variance, suppression of the mind function so that you're too tired to think straight, or perhaps your thinking is skewed a little bit. But they get the degree of control they want, that's all I need. Make you more susceptible to voting a certain party in or voting a certain bill out or what have you, whether it's here or the U.S., doesn't matter. This is what they do. Any other questions? Yes, on the way in the back.
Concerning time travel, what are the implications of, say, an object or a life form going back in time, and then the future, what future does it hold for that life form from where it came from, for example?
Well, in terms of time travel going back in time, I know that Montauk did it, and to what end or what purpose is hard to say at this point. One of the ideas and concepts about traveling backwards in time was that if you go back to a certain point in time and modify what happened there, change history, so to speak, at that local point, eliminate certain people or change certain political events and so forth, you will affect everything into the future. And there's one of the things which this Meridian group has been doing is apparently trying to modify through re-engineering the past what's happening now or going to happen in the future. It works to a point, but there is a problem. The Navy tried this, from what I was told, about 1970, 72. They claimed to have known who the head of the New World Order, the new Antichrist, was going to be. They said, well, we can eliminate him by going back in the past and murdering his father before he married, before the child was born. So ostensibly, allegedly, they did this. Didn't affect the kid. He's still around. And they went to the quantum physicists. What's going on here? And they pondered a while and came up with an answer, which may or may not be completely correct, but nevertheless they stated that time is in quanta, just like the physical universe, is that all you did was change the effects of time and the universe at that local point. It does not transmit on through. That was their explanation. I have a slightly different one. You have to change all 7 realities simultaneously or you won't be able to do it. And Montauk was capable of doing that. So it's a complicated issue. It is not a simple issue with a simple answer.
Final question, sir.
Sorry?
Final question.
Okay, one more question? All right, yours.
I'm curious if the area in Extenstein in Germany, if you know, that was used by the Germans for anything. And with you travelling around the world and lecturing about all these subjects, you seem very lucky to still be alive, given a lot of the people that you know involved in this kind of stuff.
Quite a few people, yes, in a sense you're right. Quite a few people I know are no longer alive. Phil Schneider was done in, murder by suicide. A number of other researchers have disappeared. And Phil Schneider had a friend who was an Air Force intelligence officer, retired, and they did a UFO manual magazine together. He suddenly wound up dead. It was called suicide, but the circumstances were such it could not possibly have been. Ron Rummel was the guy's name. And on and on and on. You know, there's a lot of people like this that get to know too much, and Phil said the same thing himself. He says, if anybody ever gets the total picture of what's going on this planet and who's doing what to whom, he says, you're dead. He said, they don't want any one individual to know the whole story. The information is compartmentalized and only a handful at the top know what's going on. So your question is valid, how come I'm still around? One of the answers, like my brother Duncan, and I think Preston is included in on this, and maybe Dr. von Neumann, we've traveled in time, there's a loop involved, and you don't disturb the loop that was created by this time travel by doing the person in. You have to get well past the point in time where he traveled. In the case of the Philadelphia experiment Montauk Project lockup into 1983, the equations which were laid out by Dr. Norman Levinson, the time equations, I didn't get into some of the names of these people I was going to get into, stated very clearly when you have a interruption in the time field where you interrupt its flow is that it becomes unstable, and it takes 20 years after the terminal point of that instability, which is to say 1983, it takes another 20 years to damp it out so that it becomes normally stable. The question is, what damps it out? There is no hardware that does it. It would appear, and I can't explain why, that it's a human element damps it out. Myself, Duncan, Preston, and perhaps John von Neumann, because he traveled extensively in time also. So that is one of the reasons. They got to keep us alive at least till that year, 2003. After that, maybe we're expendable. I don't know. But up to that point, they don't mess with us. Duncan was dying once, the original Duncan, and the Montauk Project after he jumped over the side of the ship the second time and went back to the future. He was dying there. They had to keep him alive, so by means of the technology they had, they went back to father in the actually the late 40s and said, get busy and make another kid. Duncan's dying. So he married again, his fifth wife. And first a sister was born, which Duncan still has, and then Duncan on 28 June 1951. But it wasn't the personality of Duncan that came in at that time. That came in on 12 August 1963. There's a very marked change in personality, which his mother noted. We know what happened now, but nobody knew at that point. They got to keep us alive. That means not too much rough stuff with us. They've never treated Duncan roughly. They hold him back in several times in the Montauk Project, but they literally captured him at night in an unconscious state, took him there, used him, and then brought him back physically unharmed. I would assume, I don't know as a fact, I would assume that attempts at physical harm, beatings, what have you, would be conducive to a lot of problems. And I don't mean problems for me personally or Duncan personally, but other problems. Okay, we got time for one more or not? It is running a little late, but okay, one more question, that's it. Yes, you have a question there.
I would like to hear a bit about extraterrestrials who are just like us.
I'm sorry, you'd like to hear about what?
Extraterrestrials.
Oh.
These people who are just like us.
Okay, I can give you a little bit on that. It's a very complex subject. The government has been, of course, looking into it for decades, and you get various stories. John Lear in Las Vegas, when he was lecturing, said that there was perhaps 17 extraterrestrial groups identified by the government, but they knew there were at least 60. Info I have coming from other directions now, Bob Dean, some of the other people who were lecturing this last week, indicate, the government knows there's many, some of them are living here. According to Phil Schneider's own data from his connections with the government, they said there were 11 extraterrestrial races living here on Earth, and they've been living here for perhaps thousands of years, underground. Most of them, except those who are strictly human in appearance and physiology, can't stand the upper atmosphere or the bright sunlight. They have to go underground. The reptilians require a special atmosphere, very warm, and minimum light. That's the way some of them are. There are human types that are very human to our appearance and are very friendly to us and are perhaps concerned about our welfare. There are others who are not so concerned about our welfare but how they can use us. So it's a quickie thumbnail sketch. It's a broad subject. There are many, many different species. Perhaps the government knows who they all are. The average UFO investigator on the outside has only a glimmering of what's going on. That includes me. I'm not a UFO expert or an extraterrestrial expert, but I have run into them in Montauk and I know they exist. Okay, thanks very much. And if you want